I'm Paddy McGuinness, and I'm an investor in Venari Security, but also an advisor. And my background's in government service, national security, latterly as the UK's intelligence, security and resilience lead, advising first David Cameron, then Theresa May, on national resilience, cybersecurity, the COBRA process that some people will be familiar with. Since leaving government service, I've been working mainly with listed and larger private equity owned companies, looking at their resilience, their security. And so I've moved from having operating capital that came from working in government and, being at the head of the table when we dealt with WannaCry or NotPetya or a Drydex attack on the National Health Service, through to now supporting companies week in, week out with technology risk. Yes, ransomware, yes, intrusions, but also misconfigurations and other things that go wrong in the modern world, given that all companies now are technology companies, all companies are data companies. Unlike some in the British market, I'm really interested in what technology problem an emerging technology is solving. And so the thing that drew me to Venari is that I was very familiar with the issues around encryption, and here was something that was taking to the next stage how we resolve the issues that encryption presents. And we've been on an interesting journey when we've had a ubiquitous encryption coming into play and an assumption that everything would become more secure as a result of it. And I go into many companies where the board, the executive leadership is saying, let's have end-to-end encryption across our business. This is surely a solution to our security problems, particularly when we've got high value protected material that we're moving about, not recognizing that actually encryption creates vulnerability and you need to be able to deal with that. And you have Darwinian effect. By encrypting, you cause your adversaries to, a bit like in judo throwing someone, use what you've done against you and for their pernicious purposes. So something I see frequently when dealing with cyber crises is an intruder is discovered. Maybe the dwell time's long, maybe it's short. The network is not monitored in such a way that the intruder and the techniques, multiple techniques used by the intruder, can truly be mapped. And there's a retrofitting by the remediation company at great cost of tools, which on reflection, the CISO says, I should have had those before these people started trying to get into my network. Yeah, and that is a classic. Now, I don't want to take away from the remediation companies. They do this work, and of course they're very happy to roll out their tools across people's networks, but actually they've got so much work coming through their doors, in a way they'd rather be doing the remediation work rather than retrofitting, kind of war footing their tools on people's networks, frankly. But I see that all the time. So there's something really interesting about when you do have an event, you never walk away with the same security architecture. You usually rush to fit, and of course it may not be necessarily all the right tools that you're fitting. You're fitting the ones that dealt with the event that's in the rearview mirror rather than actually what's coming at you. So that's one thought about what happens in these cases. So I'm a bit averse to the various competing standards that there are for measuring cyber maturity. We're ISO 27001, NIST, the Cyber Essentials framework here in the UK, whatever it is. I'm a little bit averse to all of them because it seems to me that they often are used as an obstacle in procurement processes rather than a real enabler. But you do get those really interesting rings, don't you? I think with NIST, they've got rather a good pattern where they have these two rings, one of which relates to organisation and one of which is slightly deeper. They're looking around various different aspects to look at the maturity of a business. And your problem as a CISO is you've got to be around that ring, which means, yes, you do have to have that technical and operational knowledge. Yes, absolutely, you've got to be able to do response and recovery. Absolutely, you've got to meet a regulatory need. Absolutely, you have to build a set of relationships and communicate internally, so that your leadership have confidence in you and take your advice. And you've got to be willing to say some really difficult things to power. And you've got to have an external network, because situational awareness is so difficult to gather. Yeah, so I think that light is only now coming on. And it's only now coming on because we're beginning to have worked examples of where encryption has been used by adversaries for a pernicious purpose. Yeah, and so an example would be, if I remember rightly, Colonial Pipeline. When that was attacked, the exfiltration of data and some of the command and control was done disguised as encrypted uploads to Dropbox. Yeah, and they weren't that at all, but that's what they were disguised at. And of course the SOC looked at them and said, oh, that's all right. We know what that is. That's fine. That's encrypted. That'll be secure. That'll be fine. Well, it wasn't at all. It was, and I've seen this. I can't cite all of the examples because I'm tied by NDA, but I've seen this in multiple cases where encrypted channels are part of the armory used by an intruder in order to exfiltrate data or do command and control. And then you have another set of issues which arise, which is that inevitably in businesses, when you introduce a new security technique or technology, there's an assumption that it's like it has a ratchet effect. Oh, now we've introduced that, so we can move on to the next problem. But of course, the security provided by encryption fades away, in the sense of you're using out-of-date certificated encryption. You're not using cutting edge. You haven't set it up to be cutting edge. It doesn't cover all of your operational technology. It only covers some of your information technology, and perhaps actually your primary concern should be with your operational technology, etc., etc., etc. So ransomware has changed things because it's so reckless and destructive, and because you might have encrypted data, you might also have stolen data, and you might have pressure put upon your organization through classic extortion and blackmail techniques. And those are all three slightly different things, but all of them chew you up. And once you've had a ransomware actor in your system, you have to become skeptical about your whole system. And once you've had elements of your network encrypted or interfered with, you have to reconstruct. There's a definite correlation not only between speed of detection, but also external partnership and speed of remediation and therefore recovery. So where you've got a CISO or a CIO that consciously has built relationships with their suppliers, with partners, possibly with customers, in the knowledge that they may have to deal with an incident, they know how they'd support each other, and they've got some drawdown of the skills they need, they recover they remediate far faster and recover far faster. With ransomware events, in most businesses, I rarely see a business completely back to the state prior to the intrusion, having learnt the lessons in under 6 months. Yeah, even if they've caught it really quite early, because once an intruder's been in and is reckless and may have taken data, you have to do so much on your network and so on, across your architecture to assure yourself to meet a regulatory and audit and risk standard. Then that's what your teams are doing. So long after the remediation companies and communications and crisis companies like the ones I work with have gone away, you're left with an exhausted information security or IT team trying to get back to the start line within the business. You go into an institution that says publicly, we protect our clients' data and are compliant with the General Data Protection Regulations or the Data Protection Act, and we protect your data. And then when you look at a string of encrypted traffic, you find that only a proportion of it is encrypted, and there is PII data, so personal data, often sensitive, that is flowing unencrypted through a pipe, which everyone assumes is encrypted because the header is encrypted. Okay. How does the CEO then go out and say publicly, we respect your rights, your privacy rights and, our systems are set up to protect you. It isn't true. I mean, that's what we're doing, isn't it? That's what we're finding. We're finding for all sorts of reasons. So quite a lot of the people responsible for running bits of the network don't want to be told about holes in encryption on the network because they've got lots of other things to do. And broadly speaking, it's more or less, it's 70, 80, 90% good. But if it's my data's in the 10%, and I feel less safe in the world because my data is lost, I care massively. So it's not surprising that when we take Venari security tools and we show them to audit and risk committees or to CIOs or to CISOs, whilst they don't really like the results, they want them because they want to put it right, because they want it to be true that their CEO can go out and say, we look after your data. So I was talking to a set of former colleagues, all of whom had led in different countries on national cyber resilience. And all of us, not only ourselves, but in our discussions with boards, were hearing that the value of the pound or euro or dollar spent on response and recovery is now greater than the value of the pound spent on prevention, because prevention isn't working. Attackers do get in, and once they're in, the damage they do is untold. So actually, the ability to respond and recover has become the thing that businesses are focusing on, investing ever more in. So in an age of hybrid warfare, where hostile states, not just Russia, others, are operating below the threshold of an act of war, but are trying to interfere in our societies, including by cyber and information means. So in that age, in an age of climate adaptation, when changes in our climate and extreme events are causing critical systems in society not to work in the way that they should, and at a time when we're under enormous pressure economically, and around energy, but other things too, critical national infrastructure becomes a huge focus because it is the battle space. It is where these hazard events, climate, and threat events, hybrid warfare, are playing out. So not surprisingly, governments and transnational organisations, the European Union, are heavily focused on CNI. You end up with an organisation like CISO being set up in the US. You end up with a body of regulation and discussion here in the UK. You end up with a proposed critical national infrastructure directive within the European Union. That's the first thing government does when it's dealing with something that is owned by the private sector. It says, we better regulate this. And then later, when things get worse, it begins to interfere more directly and around critical things. If you're running a nuclear power station or the telecommunications network, government's just profoundly more interested in, or a stock exchange, the government's profoundly more interested in you than if you're running, a jam factory, understandably. So critical national infrastructure, absolutely. And then that leads you on to say, understandably, because the standard applied is commercial, how can I deliver my services and be reasonably secure against law and necessity in the current environment while still beating the next man for price, broadly speaking. Understandably, as a result of that, when the weather changes or when there is an undeclared war, there's a shortfall in security and critical national infrastructure in every country. There is a shortfall. So critical national infrastructure of all the private-owned networks is being pulled out to the fore, and events which affect it change the cyber environment profoundly. One thinks of Colonial Pipeline in the US, one thinks of HSE in Ireland, the healthcare service that's there. We in the UK have been really lucky. We've had little nibbles. We've had, NHS 111 recently. We've had, WannaCry. We've had little bits and pieces have happened to us, or we've had misconfigurations in banks, which are also, technology events. But we haven't had really significant ones. But countries that have had them, it changes you. So CNI, absolutely. And what happens to CNI networks is going to drive the cyber requirements placed upon businesses more broadly. So that for me is CNI. I operate, I don't say in every country in the world, but I operate globally. I certainly operate in Asia Pacific, I operate in the Middle East, I operate into Africa, particularly South Africa, Europe, United States, UK. So I operate fairly broadly and therefore find myself in different jurisdictions with different regulatory pressures. Talking to CISOs in the US at the moment, predominantly what they do is answer regulatory pressures. So predominantly what they do is demonstrate that they've met a regulatory obligation, which is not the same as making themselves secure. It's meeting what the Fed or whoever it is says is the standard you should apply. It isn't a detailed knowledge of your own architecture and what would make it safer. It's what someone else thinks generically should be safe. So there is that aspect, I think, to being a CISO. And for some, that becomes almost all-consuming because the power of these regulators to interfere with the operations of a business and the standing of its leadership is such that the CISO must respond to it and can't say, actually, we should concentrate on making ourselves secure and manage regulation in a slightly different way. And so there is that aspect which I think is problematic. And we are seeing some CISOs who frankly have a profound regulatory knowledge who meet a kind of peacetime need to fulfill regulatory requirements, but then find themselves really stretched when they actually have an incident because they aren't as familiar with, if you like, that operational and response aspect. So I was talking to a set of former colleagues, all of whom had led in different countries on national cyber resilience. And all of us, not only ourselves, but in our discussions with boards, were hearing that the value of the pound or euro or dollar spent on response and recovery is now greater than the value of the pound spent on prevention, because prevention isn't working. Attackers do get in, and once they're in, the damage they do is untold. So actually, the ability to respond and recover has become the thing that businesses are focusing on, investing ever more in. So one of the things I find myself talking about when I talk with cybersecurity professionals is the way in which security systems are exploited by attackers. I thought it was fascinating, the example which the Department of Justice in the US brought out of the way in which they were confronting Russian activity around the Ukraine invasion, where they described efforts to remove Russian malware from a firewall which was going to be exploited as a botnet. Now, it's fascinating to see, the tip of the iceberg of a cyber war that's going on that we're not fully briefed on. And occasionally we get a glimpse, and occasionally, by mistake, people talk to the media about it. Paul Nakasone, the director of the NSA, told a journalist, oh yeah, we're toe-to-toe with the Russians. And then he said, and tried to pull back from what he said. So it's a really interesting area. Encryption's in the same category. Yeah? Encryption is regarded by audit and risk committees as being an enormous source of strength and assurance. And they're right to a high degree if the encryption is properly applied and monitored. But increasingly, it's also a tool for attackers, and also it causes an organization to drop its guard because they say, that's all right, that's encrypted. It isn't looked at as many times within the defense in depth, the multiple monitoring points that you have, because they say, that's all right, that's an encrypted pipe. But they don't look at the true nature of the encryption. Is all of the data in movement truly encrypted? And is it going to the right place? All of that stuff, is pretty conventional. But they don't look at it in the same way. That's the future. We're going to have to look at encrypted traffic as if we were looking at traffic en clair. We're just going to have to look at it that way because it's a neutral tool, not a positive security tool, and not a negative one. It's just neutral. So I think the thing that's keeping the CISO awake at night is what they're going to do when they are attacked and whether or not they've got the wherewithal to deal with what's going to confront them, because they see the catastrophic and unexpected effect that reckless ransomware attackers can have and they know they're going to have to deal with it, and they can see that they may not have all the tools. The thing that I see keeping CISOs up at night that they talk to me about is whether or not they're going to be up to dealing with the major intrusion, the major attack when it comes. Over recent years, I've become increasingly skeptical about the exhortation to build or to grow ever more people with cyber skills, because the delta between the projected number that we need and the number we're producing is getting larger and larger and larger. And that was true when I was responsible for the National Cybersecurity Strategy. I was in charge of the program, the spend, and the strategy. I had hundreds of millions of pounds to spend, and I was responsible for this strategy, right? And we couldn't meet the skills need. You could meet it if you flexed the entire education budget in the way that we have around STEM. And in a way, the Israelis have done a bit of that, but we aren't doing that in this country, and other countries aren't doing it. And anyway, when you train people and they go and sit in a SOC, after a bit, they don't want to be in a SOC anymore because it's not that interesting. They want to move on. And the bit that's missing out of our discussion of skills in the profession is automation. Machine speed and automation is what's going to enable us to lift a limited number workforce ever higher up the technology stack, so they're doing ever more stimulating and interesting things. Yeah, that's not happening enough. We've slightly parked on ways of working which are, as used to be said in Cheltenham when I worked there, mandrolic. You rely on a human being to do a thing, and it isn't fundamentally that interesting. Yeah, and then you need lots of them, and then there's a scarce supply. The price goes up, and that's what's happening a lot in the security profession. So we need to get away from this, we've got a high number we're never going to meet, and begin to think about how can we reduce that number through automation. For instance, you might have tools that looked at the quality of your encryption and where it was going and gave you assurance about it, like the ones produced by Venari Security, for instance. And that's only one example. There are lots of other areas where you want it. I think there's a bigger thing here, which is more generally how we think about technology, in that consistently, with almost all technologies that we pull through, we begin with a utopian view of what they are, and then later we spot the dystopian aspects. So with encryption, we've begun with this utopian view that it was going to make us profoundly secure from the kind of attacks we were dealing with when it was introduced. But then later we learn that it becomes actually a tool which our adversaries use to undermine our other security measures and make us less secure. So there's a Darwinian effect we have. We introduce encryption. The adversaries initially are stumped by it, but then they think, oh, we can exploit this, we can grow within this, and some of them do, and actually become more secure in their pernicious operations than they were before we had encryption. I do think that being a CISO is one of the most difficult and perhaps unforgiving jobs currently in business, because you're in a situation where you've got an endemic problem of the insecurity and instability and lack of resilience in network systems, even in really quite well-resourced organizations, and an understanding on the part of leadership, either because they've realized it themselves or because regulators or public policy people have told them that cybersecurity is a very hard to price risk. And they kind of know this because increasingly they either have to pay double for the same amount of insurance cover, they have to pay double what they were paying previously, or indeed they cannot get the insurance that they'd like because they run legacy systems within their architecture, and that can't be. So they know, their chief financial officer, their general counsel is saying to them, we've got a problem in that something we relied on to give us assurance as a business is now fading away. So they know it's a hard to price risk. So they turn around and say, what can we do? It's a board level issue. What can we do about this problem? And they turn and they look at the CIO, depending on the architecture of the company, the CIO and the CISO, who's the poor person caught between the reality of the systems and concern at board level. So I think it's a really hard job. I get most worried when I meet CISOs who are betting on bad things not happening. And consistently, I go into really quite well-run companies that have invested quite heavily and often have performed very well at the beginning of a cyber incident, of an intrusion. And I could give some examples if you like. Probably have to take the names out, but I can give them to you. But I go into these companies and where you've got a CISO who just didn't think it would happen to them, who thought it was, excuse me, I'm going to swear. I remember someone saying that they went and said to a part of the business, what are you doing about this kind of intrusion? And the business leader said to him, don't come here with all that Harry Potter shit. That stuff, we've never seen that. That's never happened to us. We know our systems. Thanks very much. We're engineers. Yeah, because they hadn't seen it. You do get CISOs because it hasn't happened to them. They say it's not going to happen to us and they don't prepare. I know that's an incredible thing to say. The ones who've prepared, who've said, if that does happen to us, I'm going to need help. So I know who I'm going to. I know who my partners are. I've already agreed with my suppliers and my partners who's going to come in and help me if something goes wrong. And indeed, in my supply chain, I'm going to help them. So I've already thought about what we do if something goes wrong, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I've got a plan for when they've got that very strong driver for changing the organization, take advantage of it. So all those things they've been arguing to change to improve security and haven't been allowed to because it affects the bottom line, and suddenly the bottom line is affected by a cyber intrusion, they say, great, now can we shut down that product? Can we upgrade this? Can I have the money to do that? And they know in their minds, in that golden period after an incident, when people are saying this can't happen again, because the costs of incidents, the loss of business, the business interruption, is so great set against the cost of cybersecurity that at that moment they'll invest. But a CISO must know what that is and have the credibility to put it through. At the beginning of our conversation, you asked me, why Venari security? And I said, because I'm really interested in seeing technology problems identified and solved. Yeah. One of the thrilling things about a scale-up company like Venari Security, is that we're doing that. We're drawing people in to work for us. They're learning not only about our technology and our technology problem, but they're learning about that dynamic response to technology change. That's what's exciting about coming into the profession. That you're not just coming to do a mandrolic basic task, you're coming to learn about how to be Darwinian, how to improve and change and see off the bad guys in the process.